So Pierre, lately UNRWA has witnessed a big financial crisis that luckily it was able to overcome. Can you tell us slightly, briefly, how you were able to manage or to bridge the gap?
When I announced to the Advisory Commission meeting in June that we had a 101 million gap, so I was talking to the donors in the room and the host countries, there was a very strong reaction by hosts. Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine were very explicit in describing their worries about what this would mean for regional stability. Now, for us in UNRWA, first and foremost, it is a question of the right to education and the fact that we remember that education is a central parameter in terms of hope for Palestine refugees. And you know it better than anybody else that this has been a central element for Palestinians in your history. But in particular for Palestine refugees, education is the element that allows young people to think about something else for the future. And I think when we spoke about that with both reason and passion, because it's not a question of just presenting a paper to donors and saying A, B, C. It's about speaking about the passion. What's the passion mean? The passion means that when I was in Yarmouk this year, and I met with families from Yarmouk that have gone through so much catastrophe and disaster over the last 2 to 3 years because of the siege, the presence of armed groups, the deprivation, the lack of food. And they were describing to me all of that. And after 10 minutes, they called over a boy, they called over a girl and said, this boy has not been to school in the last 6 months. This girl couldn't go to attend her education and her exams. UNRWA, what are you doing about it? So that in the middle of the worst humanitarian disaster of this current period in the Middle East, Palestine refugees are thinking immediately about education. When I saw a young Palestine refugee girl in Ain el-Helwe, she was from Syria. The school principal introduced me to her and said, this is a 13-year-old. She fled Syria. She lost her father on the way. She lost a brother on the way. She's the highest performing student in my school. And I as a 20-year-old teacher and school principal cannot explain how such a thing is possible. So we see the importance and the depth of education. And it is everywhere, from the West Bank to Jordan to Gaza. This is where the heart of Palestine refugees beats. It's around education. So with passion and conviction, we were able to rally people around the idea that the cost of delaying the school year is just much higher than the money put into allowing us to open it. And we were successful in that, and I think it should be a measure of great satisfaction with all the humility that goes with it, that we achieved this.
Was it the demonstrations and the actions that were taken by the parents, by the unions, and by other were those the trigger, were those the main issue that made UNRWA management move to try to bridge this gap?
Sincerely, I think it was UNRWA's management's realization that when you have 101 million missing, to close the gap and to ensure that all your core services are being provided, that's a very serious issue. And we decided not to pretend that this is a real crisis. We decided to recognize that it's something that we have to deal with and reach out to donors, but also to take certain measures internally to make our contribution to reducing the deficit. Mm-hmm. Because it's very difficult to go to the donors and ask for more money during the year if you are not seen to take a certain number of steps yourselves. Mm-hmm. So we took steps internally. They were not always easy. They were not necessarily easy to implement or always popular. But they gave us the basis of recognition and trust for the donors to make that move. What the peaceful protests and all of the messages of worry and anxiety did was that they were very supportive in the messaging that we were putting forward to the international community. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, why everybody in a certain sense made a contribution to the successful outcome.
So you have seen these demonstrations and these activities as a support to the efforts that UNRWA management was trying to do to overcome this financial crisis?
I think during the period before I declared that we had enough money to open the schools, the steps that were taken as peaceful protests, mm-hmm. Yes, I think those were important moments. I think it was, to be very sincere, also a delicate time after I had announced that we had enough money to have the schools, that further actions, specifically in the case of Gaza, were taken, mm-hmm. because you have to understand that, of course, when donors mobilized to give the amount of money, and we announced that schools would open, any delay, of course, that was created later on would be looked at by donors with a series of questions. And I think this is why we also worked very, very swiftly to bring that phase to an end, to return to dialogue and to look for solutions.
Mm-hmm. Pierre, you've just returned from a meeting with the local staff union. Can you tell us a bit about the outcome, the discussions and the outcome of that meeting?
Well, we had specifically here in Gaza a discussion about the class formation exercise, because there were concerns about the exact class size average, how that would impact on whether Gaza, which is the only field which has an increased number of school children in schools every year, would be able to also recruit teachers and everything. So we found an agreement. I came and I had committed to come with a solution to propose. We had a discussion with the union here. We've come to an agreement in terms of the average class size, which will not be higher than 39.5 for Gaza. So this is, I think, an important step which will allow a process of recruitment of additional teachers to take place. It is not for the Commissioner-General then to get into the details. That will be followed up now by the director and the unions and the education team. Another issue that, of course, has always been part of my discussions in recent weeks with the unions, but also with staff at a very large scale, is the rule that I introduced early August on exceptional leave. Now, on exceptional leave, there were many, many questions that were addressed to me, and I realized that it created a lot of uncertainty for employment. There were real worries that people had about what does it mean, can we be suspended in this way? I just want to very shortly clarify, the rule has been established because before introducing it, the only option I would have had with a deficit of 100 million, if we had not received any money, would have been to separate staff in the interest of the agency. That was the only pre-existing rule. With this rule, what I could do, an exceptional leave, is to suspend the payments because we don't have the money, but you actually protect the contracts. You don't dismiss staff, you maintain and protect the contracts, and you defer the payment until you have the money. Mm-hmm. Now, this rule, I think, is important to be understood as a protective measure. However, I have heard everywhere that people feel very strongly about it, that they have many worries still associated with it. So, hearing the messages from staff at large and from unions, I've simply indicated that I would give myself a little bit more time to reflect on this. I had frozen the rule already, which was a first step very clearly. And I've told the unions that I would continue my reflection on this, hearing the messages and analyzing that situation further.
Mm-hmm. Why is it education that is being put into this risk?
Well, there's again several aspects to focus on. The first is the size of the deficit this year was unprecedented, the biggest we've ever had. So maybe in the past, the way in which UNRWA discussed internally about the deficit was a little bit, we've heard it. Even when I joined UNRWA, I heard it. Oh, the deficit is there every year. Oh, the deficit is something which, in the end, the management announces, but then in the end, the donors come in and somehow miraculously save the day. That's a little bit the kind of discussion we hear, right? Now, if I can say it here like this, and forgive me for the simplicity of the formula, this reminds me of, it's a little bit like if we're sitting in an UNRWA car, driving at high speed on the highway, and in front of us we see a big wall, and this wall is the deficit. But we're discussing inside the car whether this is a real wall or whether this maybe is one of these miraculous walls that when you hit it, you drive through it. It's a very bad strategy. And it is exactly this way of discussing it in previous years that has led us to the most significant deficit in our history. So we decided this year to tackle it differently. We decided to be very open about it. And that means we were clear about the fact that it is no longer about spare parts. It's no longer only about, whether we paint the buildings this year or not. It was so big that it was going to run the risk of affecting our core services, which means we have to take serious measures now about it. We cannot continue to have the same conversations about the deficit, because if we do, it will get worse next year, and that is not a responsible way of managing an agency that stands for 5 million Palestine refugees and the education of 500,000 children. I understand that there are, and I was in many town hall meetings and discussions with staff in recent weeks, where colleagues communicated the fear that this may be only the beginning of something that could lead to a sort of dismantling of UNRWA, that this is something, that there's a plan somewhere to address that this is actually a political crisis, not a financial crisis. Now let me just say what I feel about that. It is a financial crisis, but I understand perfectly that Palestine refugees, when they see this issue and when they see that it touches or risks touching education, they think about the political dimension. Why? Because for 67 years, Palestine refugees have been denied justice. Because for 50 years in Palestine, they have lived under occupation. Because for almost 10 years in Gaza, they have lived under, and you have lived under, the blockade and all the resulting violence. Because in Syria, there's a disastrous conflict that is tearing apart families and communities, including of Palestine refugees. So of course, a Palestine refugee will first of all think in political terms about everything that's happening. I fully understand that. But if I say that this is a political crisis, it also means that people somewhere else will decide about the solution, right? And I'm not prepared to let that happen. I believe that we in UNRWA have to take the decisions to get out of the financial crisis, not invite others to decide it. It is our responsibility. And when you have the responsibility, it means you take some of the tough decisions, even if they're unpopular, and then you move forward, and then you're more credible to engage the donors to get the rest of the money. That's how we must do it. The mandate we received from the UN General Assembly. The vast majority of countries represented there are supportive of UNRWA's mandate. And I will tell you like this. If I detect anywhere in the world a dynamic which would start to question UNRWA's mandate, I will not wait for anybody to speak about it. I will speak about it and denounce it before anybody else does. So Palestine refugees can remain assured that UNRWA is not only a service provider, we remain the witness of the injustice that has taken place. We will stand our ground on that and defend this. There is nothing to be negotiated on that part. Our mandate, I've said it before and I repeat it here, is not for sale.
Do you expect that next year you will have another financial crisis, or do you expect that you will be able to bridge this additional deficit?
So the first thing is there will be a larger deficit next year if we don't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. If we sit back and say, thank God we've closed the 2015, and if we think that simply by expressing the hope that donors will give that same amount next year, we will manage, for sure we will be in another problem next year. Mm-hmm. Now, why is it? What you asked is very important. There is an increase in terms of needs because of the demographics, because of the number of Palestine refugees, because of the increased number, for example, of children enrolling in schools in Gaza specifically, but also because UNRWA is not only an organization that deals with these long-term human development programs such as education, healthcare, and relief and social services, but because we work in emergencies. And speaking here from Gaza, we know what we speak about from last summer and what the emergencies bring in terms of needs and in terms of devastation and in terms of suffering. And we know what it means in Syria, where we know that in the past, very few Palestine refugees were dependent on UNRWA because they had access to jobs, they had employment. Yarmouk was famous as a camp where people were able to cover the needs of their families themselves, as, by the way, any family in the world wishes to do. Mm-hmm. So, as the region has become more unstable, in addition to our long-term education and healthcare programs, we have multiple other needs to cover. So the pressure on us has grown. The rhythm of increase of needs has been far greater than the rhythm of increase of contributions. This is where we have the problem. Yes. And so what we will do now is to design what I call sometimes internally a sort of the next phase, the phase 2. Phase 1 was to close the deficit this year. Phase 2 is the strategy that we need to avoid being in the same situation next year. And I can tell you, we will work extremely hard to never again allow UNRWA's core services to be affected or to risk to be affected as we had it this year. That will take a special combination of measures, but this is our determination.
Is there anything you want to tell us about phase 2?
I will have a special meeting with ministers from about 20 countries at the UN General Assembly to discuss UNRWA's future financial stability. Now, I think what everyone has to understand, to reach that stability, we will have to take certain steps ourselves. And I have to say that everywhere I go, to every meeting I've been to in recent weeks with senior staff, in town halls, colleagues tell me, yes, there is waste in the agency. There are things where we are spending the money unnecessarily. Somebody called it the fat in the agency, said, cut down some of the fat, protect the bones, protect the body, protect the heart. But yes, we should do. So we all know that there are certain things that we can reduce internally, and then we will be in a stronger position to go back to the donors and tell them, maintain the levels of additional money that you have provided this year. I have already started by going to Saudi Arabia, to Kuwait, where I raised exactly these issues. And I hope we can, by combining these two elements, bring once UNRWA to a phase, a year or a few years, where our lives are not defined by the deficit, but they are defined by the deep cause that UNRWA represents. The speaking about the injustice, improving the quality of our programs, and including also discussing some of the legitimate concerns that staff have about their working conditions. All of this we can start to improve working on when we have tackled that deficit and brought ourselves to a better position. So that's what phase 2 may look like.
So if I understand you well, that you are having a long-term plan to secure funds for the future. That's the ultimate goal of the management right now.
It is, and to be honest, because not only are there some countries where we know that they cannot maybe give more, others where we have indications, yes, we can give some more, others where we really believe they should be giving more, some countries like China, Russia, South Korea, which we're investing on also now because we want to broaden the base, but there are also institutions that UNRWA has never connected with. There are trust funds in the world that focus on education. Why would UNRWA not receive support from such trust funds? Well, we haven't asked until now. So we will also try to ask our donors to support us in initiatives to reach funds which for the moment we have not connected with. I want to be very honest with everybody. This is going to be a really tough exercise, very tough. But I think it is 1,000 times worth the effort. And we do have a real opportunity to succeed.
And at the end, is there anything you would want, a message that you would want to share with the staff and with the refugees at large?
This is also a time for healing. When you've had a crisis as tough as the one we've had, there's always scars. You know, it's like a human being. When you go through a crisis, you can come out of it. But a certain number of scars will be there. A certain number of worries will remain. A certain number of doubts have been created. I just simply say to everybody, UNRWA stands extremely firm in the defense of the mandate, in the defense of the integrity of this agency, in the defense of the rights of Palestine refugees, and we will never move on that. But now is the time to listen, now is the time to exchange in dialogue, to return to dialogue, so that we can come stronger out of this crisis and prepare the ground for the future with a very open and transparent approach. If we can manage that, I actually think we will have done something very good altogether.
Pierre, thank you very much for this interview, and I look forward to seeing you in the next interview and inshallah better circumstances.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.